The house had been empty for 8 years. 8 long years since my grandparents passed away within months of each other, leaving behind a peeling white farmhouse at the edge of Millfield County, and a silence no one in our family ever dared to break. Until me, I was the only one who volunteered to clean it out before the county auctioned it off. My parents called it just an old property. My uncle called it a money pit, but to me, it was the place where summers smelled like fresh bread and old books. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into the driveway. The porch sagged slightly on the left side, just like I remembered. Paint curled off the walls like dried leaves. The windows were dusty, lifeless. It looked forgotten, but when I stepped inside, it didn't feel empty. The air was thick with the scent of wood and time. Furniture still stood where it had always been. Grandpa's recliner angled toward the fireplace. Grandma's knitting basket resting beside it, like they had just stepped out for a moment. I shook off the chill creeping up my spine and got to work. I opened curtains. I let light spill into the rooms. I packed old dishes into boxes. I sorted through decades of photographs. And then I heard it, a phone ringing. Sharp, loud, impossible. I froze. There hadn't been a working landline here in years. The service had been disconnected after my grandfather died. I knew that for a fact, but the ringing continued, echoing from somewhere deep inside the house. Slowly, I followed the sound down the narrow hallway toward their bedroom. Each step felt heavier than the last. The ringing stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stood there, staring at the half-open bedroom door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I pushed the door open. Nothing. The room looked untouched, the bed neatly made, lace curtains yellowed with age. The old rotary phone still sat on Grandma's nightstand. And then it rang again, right in front of me. I jumped back so hard I nearly hit the dresser. The cord wasn't even plugged into anything. It hung loose behind the table. But the phone kept ringing. My hands trembled as I stepped forward. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself. The ringing stopped abruptly. The silence pressed against my ears. I stared at the receiver for a long moment. Then, against every rational thought in my mind, I picked it up. "Hello?" My voice cracked. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, a familiar voice. Soft. Calm. "Eli." My blood ran cold. It was my grandfather's voice, exactly as I remembered it. Warm, deep, certain. "This can't be happening," I breathed. "You need to listen carefully," the voice continued, steady as ever. "There isn't much time." I nearly dropped the receiver. "Who is this?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. "You weren't told the truth?" he said. "About the house. About what's under it." My pulse spiked. "What are you talking about?" A crackle of static filled the line. "Basement. Behind the furnace. The second panel." My stomach twisted. There was no second panel. At least, none that I remembered. "You have to trust me, Eli," the voice said. "They're coming." The line went dead. I stood there frozen, the receiver still pressed to my ear. The dial tone never returned. Just silence. Slowly, mechanically, I placed the receiver back onto its cradle. My mind raced. Someone had to be playing a trick on me. Some sick joke. But how? There was no power. No phone line. No signal. And yet, I had heard him. Every word. I turned toward the hallway. The house felt different now. Watching. Waiting. My breathing grew shallow. "They're coming." Who? Why? I swallowed hard and forced myself to move. If this was some kind of prank, I would prove it. I grabbed a flashlight from my toolbox and headed toward the basement door in the kitchen. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I descended. The air grew colder. Damp! The single basement bulb flickered weakly when I flipped the switch, surprisingly. It still worked. The old furnace stood exactly where it always had, rust creeping along its sides. And behind it, I hesitated. There was no second panel, just a solid concrete wall. I almost laughed at myself. Grief does strange things to people. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe I imagined everything. But as I turned to leave, my foot hit something, a loose metal edge near the furnace base. I knelt down and saw it, a thin vertical seam in the wall, hidden beneath years of dust. My heart began pounding again. Slowly, I pressed against it. The panel shifted, just slightly. I stared at the dark gap forming in the concrete. And then, from upstairs, I heard the front door creak open. The front door closed with a slow, deliberate click. Not a gust of wind, not old wood settling. Someone had just walked into the house. My pulse slammed against my ribs. I was still kneeling beside the hidden panel in the basement wall, fingers pressed against cold concrete. "They're coming!" My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind. Slowly, I pushed the panel wider. It scraped softly against the floor, revealing a narrow cavity between the walls. Inside sat a small metal lockbox covered in dust. Footsteps creaked above me. Measured. Unhurried. They knew I was here. I grabbed the lockbox and pulled it free just as another floorboard groaned overhead directly above the basement stairs. They were heading toward the kitchen. Toward me! My breathing turned shallow. I killed the basement light and crouched in darkness. The basement door hinge whined softly. A beam of light sliced down the stairs. "Well," a man's voice called casually. "Looks like someone beat us to it." U.S. There was more than one. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. 2 sets of shoes descended the steps. Expensive leather from the sound of it. "Check behind the furnace," the second voice muttered. My stomach dropped. They knew. They knew exactly where to look. The flashlight beam moved across the furnace. Then pause. Panels open. Silence. He found it. My fingers tightened around the lockbox. My only option was the old cellar window on the far side of the basement, half boarded, barely big enough to squeeze through. While their attention was on the wall, I crawled backward in the dark, keeping low. My shoulder brushed against cold stone. I reached the window. One of them cursed quietly, spread out. I shoved the loose board aside and forced myself through the narrow opening, scraping my arms as I dropped into the tall grass outside. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I locked the doors and drove half a mile down the road before pulling over. Heart racing, hands shaking, I stared at the lockbox sitting in my passenger seat. What was so important that strangers would break into an abandoned farmhouse to find it? I forced it open using a tire iron. Inside were 3 things: a thick envelope, a small flash drive, and an old newspaper clipping dated 23 years ago. My breath caught when I read the headline, "Local land dispute turns violent. Developer investigated." The article detailed how a corporate development company had tried to seize farmland across Millfield County through legal loopholes and intimidation. Several landowners had mysteriously dropped their cases. One name was circled in pen: my grandfather's. Inside the envelope were legal documents, original deeds, contracts, evidence of forged signatures. Proof. The flash drive likely contained more. That's when it hit me. The auction. The county wasn't just selling an old house. They were reclaiming land, developing it, and if those documents surfaced, it would destroy everything. The men in that basement weren't random thieves. They were sent to make sure this evidence never saw daylight. My phone buzzed suddenly in my hand. Unknown number. I stared at it, then answered. A calm voice spoke. "You should have left the house alone." My chest tightened. "You broke in," I shot back. A soft chuckle. "That property doesn't belong to you. It hasn't for a long time." "You forged the deeds," I said quietly. Silence. "Then, you don't understand how powerful the people behind this are." "Maybe not," I replied, staring at my grandfather's name circled in ink. "But I understand why he called me." The voice sharpened. "What are you talking about?" I didn't answer because I finally understood. The phone call hadn't been a ghost. It had been preparation. My grandfather had known they would come back one day. He had hidden the evidence, and somehow he made sure I would be the one to find it. Maybe not through a miracle. Maybe through something smarter. A backup line, a timed device, a security measure triggered when power reconnected. He had always been 10 steps ahead of everyone, including them. "You still there?" the voice demanded. "Yes," I said calmly. "And I'm not alone anymore." I hung up. Then I drove straight to the county sheriff's office. 3 months later, the investigation exploded across the state. The development company was exposed for fraud, coercion, and illegal land seizures spanning decades. Multiple arrests were made. The auction was canceled permanently, and the farmhouse, it was legally restored to our family name. I went back alone one evening after everything settled. The house felt lighter, warmer. I walked into their bedroom. The old rotary phone sat quietly on the nightstand, unplugged, silent. I stared at it for a long moment. "Thank you," I whispered, "for protecting the land, for protecting the truth, for protecting me." As I turned to leave, a faint breeze moved through the curtains, and for just a second, I could have sworn I heard the softest echo of a dial tone, not haunting, not frightening, just complete. Some inherit money, some inherit property. I inherited courage, and one ringing phone that changed everything.